Okay, hello. 5 June, dis&datInformation, theautonomouscollective.net, Lenin on monopoly capital. Uh, we've been sitting in on a 4 evening short course on imperialism that the People's Forum is doing, and today I'm going to do the uh, some of the prep that you would need for this evening's session, which is mainly all the last three sessions this Thursday, today, next Tuesday, and then the following, a week from today, is all excerpts from Lenin on imperialism. And clearly not the entire text. So I did a thing today and to prep for this, where I'm not necessarily going to have to read Lenin because I got I have the audio book to read from, so um, you don't get my Finland station impression or whatever. So after some yammering, I've included the entire text. That is the reading for tonight, from 6:30 Eastern to 8:30 Eastern. But I also included, as I said, the complete audio book for the text, as well as some other elements at the end. It was interesting to me that tacked on at the end, and I'm not sure whether that was intentional or not, actually, in terms of the reading, it is commentary that also fits with, the other thing that we have to read for class unity. Yes, I know it seems busy, but these are relatively simple readings. And that is what I read yesterday, the introduction to Monopoly Capital by Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy, the other two Pauls. And I've included in today's thing a little explanation about monopoly and some explanation, not a horrible amount, on oligopoly, monopoly, and competition and cartels. So I know that can be confusing. What is more interesting as a matter of confusion, it is the desire for monopoly by people like Peter Thiel or Tile, and this is from his article, "Competition is for Losers." This is ideologically different than uh, free market libertarianism, right? You want to dominate the market. That's what the Thielists believe in. It's not about perfect competition. It's not about fairness. It is about domination, which is kind of there's a whole thing about it, but that a variety of these tech bros sort of have come up with. So that's included at the far end. But I hope you'll take a look at it because it is a different way of thinking about monopoly and monopoly capital. And this is not a confusing matter. It is just wrong. I mean, just wrong from a definitional point of view, from a denotative point of view. So Peter Thiel will say the opposite of perfect competition is monopoly. Well, the opposite of perfect competition is imperfect competition, which is which can be monopoly, but it's a whole bunch of other things that also are being played with. That is domination of a market, um, clearly collusion among entities, between the state and big business, major corporations, etc. That's also imperfect. It can be a version of oligopoly, which means many or a couple of monopolists that can collude, and in fact often do. And then there's cartelization, which is pretty much the same as oligopoly, but in certain places you have actual cartelization. And you could even argue that the political system in the United States is a not just a duopoly, that is between two major parties, but maybe even a cartel. Particularly at the at the state and federal level. So the question I'm asking is a steady state economy of the traditional steady state economies that, Herman Daly, you know, Schumacher, is it the same as heat death? Because that's what Thiel calls it. It calls any kind of static or steady state economy a heat death. So there's wrong thinking somewhere, and I would say the wrong thinking is on the tech bro side. I'm going to read part of section 3 because this is the meat of the Lenin, and useful to think about because it does apply to the current day. Quote, a steadily increasing proportion of capital in industry, writes Rudolf Hilferding, ceases to belong to the industrialists who employ it. They obtain the use of it only through the medium of the banks, which, in relation to them, represent the owners of the capital. On the other hand, the bank is forced to sink an increasing share of its funds in industry. Thus, to an ever greater degree, the banker is being transformed into an industrial capitalist. This bank capital, i.e., capital in money form, which is thus actually transformed into industrial capital, I call finance capital. Finance capital is capital controlled by banks and employed by industrialists. That all seems actually quite logical. And it is more complicated now under financialization, and financialization has become its own, Frankenstein monster, as 2008 has revealed. This definition is incomplete insofar as it is silent on one extremely important fact. This is Lenin, right? On the increase of concentration of production and of capital to such an extent that concentration is leading and has led to monopoly. Concentration is referring to production, but also consumption in terms of a market. It's a competitive market that has been distorted by monopoly. But throughout the whole of his work, and particularly in the 2 chapters preceding the one from which this definition is taken, Rudolf Hilferding stresses the part played by capitalist monopolies, the concentration of production, the monopolies arising therefrom, the merging or coalescence of the banks with industry. Such is the history of the rise of finance capital, and such is the content of that concept. We now have to describe how, under the general conditions of commodity production and private property, the business operations of capitalist monopolies inevitably lead to the domination of a financial oligarchy. So all those things are there, pretty much the same now with more variations on them, right? With hedge funds and other kinds of funny aspects, but they really behave all the same way. So what is a financial oligarchy? So I, went for another denotative thing. The following article is short from the great Soviet encyclopedia. It might be, the page says, be outdated or ideologically biased. Oh, no. A financial oligarchy is the elite of the monopolistic bourgeoisie, the major owners of capital, the most influential representatives of commercial, industrial, and financial monopolies, embodying the dominance of finance capital in the economic and political life of capitalist countries in the imperialist stage. Not that much has changed from 1916 to 1979. The financial oligarchy arises from the coalescence of industrial and banking capital that results from the concentration and centralization of production and capital. Financial monopolistic groups, that is, amalgamations of industrial, banking, and commercial monopolies with the largest monopoly in each group exercising control, are the form of the oligarchy's dominance. The financial oligarchy exercises control over vast amounts of social capital and wealth, and over the activities of commercial and industrial corporations, credit and financial institutions, and multinational monopolies. The control derives from the oligarchy's own capital and from the monetary resources and savings of various classes and social strata of bourgeois society that have been mobilized through a ramified network of credit and financial institutions. Dominance is ensured through holding systems, personal link-ups, and other types of long-term relationships. That is, the formation of corporations and cartels, and the issuance of stock. V.I. Lenin observed, quoting directly from Lenin, finance capital concentrated in a few hands and exercising a virtual monopoly, issue of stock, state loans, etc., strengthens the domination of the financial oligarchy and levies tribute upon the whole of society for the benefit of monopolists. The financial and industrial elite controls the decision-making process in the realm of economic and social policy. It coordinates and directs the coalescence of the economic power of the monopolies and the political power of the bourgeois state into a single mechanism. The state monopolistic regulatory programs designed to ameliorate the contradictions of capitalism ultimately serve the interests of the financial oligarchy. The internationalization of economic life, the intensification of integrative processes, and the development of multinational industrial and banking monopolies promote the emergence of financial groups that are international in composition and influence and lead to an ever closer intertwining of the interests of the financial oligarchies of different capitalist countries. The structure of the financial oligarchy is modified with the development of state monopoly capitalism and the evolution of various forms of capitalist ownership. In imperialism's formative stage, the financial oligarchy developed primarily on the basis of family dynasties, Rockefellers, Morgans, DuPonts, and Mellons in the United States, Rothschilds, Lazard, and Barings in Great Britain, Rothschild, Michelin, and Peugeots in France. The concentration of production and the expansion of fictitious capital, recall fictitious capital, from Marx's Volume 1, Capital, and the competitive struggle between monopolistic alliances favored regional financial oligarchies. Now, the trend was especially pronounced after World War II, as seen in Cleveland, Chicago, California, and Boston financial groups in the United States, and the Bavarian group in the Federal Republic of Germany. The family dynasty, however, continued to figure in the structure of the financial oligarchy between the 1950s and 1970s. That is, the financial empires of the Gettys and the Hunts in the United States, and of the Oppenheims, Thorn, and Toxis, and Kielmann-Stums in the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany. The entry of top-level managers into the financial oligarchy has also been typical of the post-war period. The financial oligarchy's dominance reflects the stagnation of capitalism and exacerbates the socioeconomic contradictions between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and between the developed and the developing countries. So needless to say, Russia in the post-1991 has financial oligarchies and complicated ones. Putin represents the head of a financial oligarchy that in a sort of major move was consolidated by him and it continues to be so because he's the president. Needless to say, you can see what happens to challengers in that context. Now, what I've also added, or what I wanted to read from today, is the theory of state monopoly capitalism. And if you look at this particular Wikipedia entry, what it does describe is the various ideological divisions among various radical groups. That is, you can distinguish, you even find out on this page, where Linda LaRouche stands relative to these issues ultimately. So there are important matters that we can't discuss here, but that we should be aware of. State monopoly capitalism has been around for a while, also referred as Stam-Mo-Cap. It's like Comintern, right? As in Communist International, was initially a Marxist thesis popularized after World War II. Lenin had claimed in 1916, yes, the same text, that World War I had transformed laissez-faire capitalism into monopoly capitalism, but he did not publish any extensive theory about the topic. The stuff we're reading for these two different sessions is, kind of it. The term refers to an environment where the state intervenes in the economy to protect larger monopolistic or oligopolistic businesses from threats. As conceived by Lenin in his pamphlet of the same name, the theory aims to describe the final historical stage of capitalism, of which he believed the imperialism of that time to be the highest expression. The main Marxist-Leninist thesis is that big business, having achieved a monopoly or cartel position in most markets of importance, fuses with the government apparatus. State monopoly capitalism protected monopolistic economics from competition by smaller firms. You create barriers to entry. There's all kinds of ways that happens. On a larger scale, think Walmart. The strategic political implication of the theory for Marxist-Leninists towards the end of the Joseph Stalin era and afterwards was that the labor movement should form a People's Democratic Alliance under the leadership of the Communist Party with the progressive middle classes and small business against the state and big business, called monopoly for short. Sometimes this alliance was also called the Anti-Monopoly Alliance. Now, what's more interesting, of course, is people who claim that they're Leninists. And Stephen Bannon, noted right-wing crazy, radical Catholic, etc., and advisor to Trump, declared himself a Leninist. Lenin wanted to destroy the state, and that's my goal too. I want to bring everything crashing down and destroy all of today's establishment. Now, he said this in 2013, much before the rise of Trump. He really hasn't changed his mind. He just does, no one asks him about it. Let's put it that way. What Bannon might actually be is what some people have described as a neoliberal narcissist, and what the GOP who believe him or follow in that kind of mind might be that vanguard party. Although, it's hard to imagine the GOP as a Leninist party. Needless to say, there is a distortion of that, and of course, a manipulation rhetorically. And I don't think we're going to mistake Steve Bannon for a Leninist at any moment. Now, the other thing, of course, is that there is the reading of the thing itself, which I have been doing at periodic moments. Let me begin reading, and then I'll probably start the tape, as they say. The session tonight in Class Unity is on monopoly capitalism. It's sections 1 through 3 of Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Lenin, 1916. There's a link to the original. Number 1, the concentration of production and monopolies. The enormous growth of industry and the remarkably rapid concentration of production in ever larger enterprises are one of the most characteristic features of capitalism. Modern production censuses give most complete and most exact data on this process. In Germany, for example, out of every 1,000 industrial enterprises, large enterprises, i.e., those employing more than 50 workers, numbered 3 in 1882, 6 in 1895, and 9 in 1907. And out of every 100 workers employed, this group of enterprises employed 22, 30, and 37, respectively. The concentration of production, however, is much more intense than the concentration of workers, since labor in the large enterprises is much more productive. Now, this is shown by the figures on steam engines and electric motors. If we take what in Germany is called industry in the broad sense of the term, that is, including commerce, transport, etc., we get the following picture. Large-scale enterprises, 30,000 out of a total of 3 million, that is to say, 0.9%. These enterprises employ 5 million workers out of a total of 14 million, i.e., 39.4%. They use 6 million steam horsepower out of a total of 8.8 million, i.e., 75%, and 1,200,000 kilowatts of electricity out of a total of 1,500,000. That is 77%. Less than 1/100th of the total number of enterprises utilizes more than 3/4 of the total amount of steam and electric power. Now, apply that in the current age to crypto, for example. 2,970,000 small enterprises employing up to 5 workers, constituting 91% of the total, utilize only 7% of the total amount of steam and electric power. Tens of thousands of huge enterprises are everything. Millions of small ones are nothing. In 1907, there were in Germany 586 establishments employing 1,000 and more workers, nearly 1/10, that is 1,003,38 of the total number of workers employed in industry, and they consumed almost 1/3, 32% of the total amount of steam and electric power. As we shall see, money capital and the banks make this superiority of a handful of the largest enterprises still more overwhelming in the most literal sense of the word, i.e., millions of small, medium, and even some big proprietors are in fact in complete subjection to some hundreds of millionaire financiers. In another advanced country of modern capitalism, the United States of America, the growth of the concentration of production is still greater. Here, statistics single out industry in the narrow sense of the word and classify enterprises according to the value of their annual output. So in 1904, large-scale enterprises with an output valued at only at $1 million and over numbered 1,900 out of 216,000. That is 0.9%, and these employed 1.4 million workers out of 5.5, that is 25%, and the value of their output amounted to 5.6 billion out of 14 billion, i.e. 38%. 5 years later, in 1909, the corresponding figures were 3,060 enterprises out of 268,000, i.e. 1.1%, employing 2 million workers out of 6 million, with an output valued at 9 billion out of 20 billion. Almost half the total production of all the enterprises of the country was carried on by 1/100th part of these enterprises. These 3,000 giant enterprises embrace 258 branches of industry. So I hope that it's a lot of numbers, but Lenin, trying to use the data. And so let's listen to the reading of this. Note that it's almost 5 hours long, and other matters will intervene.
Thank you for listening to Foreign Languages Press audiobooks. If you'd like to support the publishing house or this audiobook project, you can do so by heading.
Oh, bloody hell. Come on.
To Foreign Languages Press audiobooks. If you'd like to support the publishing house or this audiobook project, you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/foreignlanguagespress or by clicking the Support This Podcast link in the episode description. Thanks so much for supporting revolutionary media.
Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, by Vladimir Lenin. Preface. The pamphlet here presented to the reader was written in the spring of 1916 in Zurich. In the conditions in which I was obliged to work there, I naturally suffered somewhat from a shortage of French and English literature and from a serious dearth of Russian literature. However, I made use of the principal English work on imperialism, the book by J.A. Hobson, with all the care that, in my opinion, the work deserves. This pamphlet was written with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. Hence, I was not only forced to confine myself strictly to an exclusively theoretical, specifically economic analysis of facts, but to formulate the few necessary observations on politics with extreme caution, by hints in an allegorical language, in that accursed Aesopian language to which Tsarism compelled all revolutionaries to have recourse whenever they took up the pen to write a legal work. It is painful, in these days of liberty, to reread the passages of the pamphlet which have been distorted, cramped, compressed in an iron vice on account of the censor. That the period of imperialism is the eve of socialist revolution, that social chauvinism, socialism in words, chauvinism in deeds, is the utter betrayal of socialism, complete desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie, that this split in the working class movement is bound up with the objective conditions of imperialism, etc. On these matters I had to speak in a slavish tongue, and I must refer the reader who is interested in the subjects to the articles I wrote abroad in 1914 to 1917, a new edition of which is soon to appear. In order to show the reader, in a guise acceptable to the censors, how shamelessly untruthful the capitalists and the social chauvinists who have deserted to their side, and whom Kautsky opposes so inconsistently, are on the question of annexations. In order to show how shamelessly they screen the annexations of their capitalists, I was forced to quote as an example Japan. The careful reader will easily substitute Russia for Japan, and Finland, Poland, Courland, the Ukraine, Khiva, Bokhara, Estonia, or other regions peopled by non-Great Russians for Korea. I trust that this pamphlet will help the reader to understand the fundamental economic question, that of the economic essence of imperialism, for unless this is studied, it will be impossible to understand and appraise modern war and modern politics. Author, Petrograd, April 26, 1917. Preface to the French and German editions. As was indicated in the preface to the Russian edition, this pamphlet was written in 1916 with an eye to the Tsarist censorship. I was unable to revise the whole text at the present time, nor, perhaps, would this be advisable, since the main purpose of the book was, and remains, to present, on the basis of the summarized returns of irrefutable bourgeois statistics and the admissions of bourgeois scholars of all countries, a composite picture of the world capitalist system in its international relationships at the beginning of the 20th century, on the eve of the First World Imperialist War. To a certain extent, it will even be useful for many communists in advanced capitalist countries to convince themselves by the example of this pamphlet, legal from the standpoint of the Tsarist censor, of the possibility and necessity of making use of even the slight remnants of legality which still remain at the disposal of the communists, say, in contemporary America or France, after the recent almost wholesale arrests of communists, in order to explain the utter falsity of social pacifist views and hopes for world democracy. The most essential of what should be added to this censored pamphlet I shall try to present in this preface. It is proved in the pamphlet that the war of 1914 to 18 was imperialist, that is, an annexationist, predatory war of plunder. On the part of both sides, it was a war for the division of the world, for the partition and repartition of colonies and spheres of influence of finance, capital, etc. Proof of what was the true social, or rather the true class character of the war is naturally to be found not in the diplomatic history of the war, but in an analysis of the objective position of the ruling classes in all the belligerent countries. In order to depict this objective position, one must not take examples or isolated data in view of the extreme complexity of the phenomena of social life. It is always possible to select any number of examples or separate data to prove any proposition, but all the data on the basis of economic life in all the belligerent countries and the whole world. It is precisely irrefutable summarized data of this kind that I quoted in describing the partition of the world in 1876 and 1914 in Chapter 6, and the division of the world's railways in 1890 and 1913 in Chapter 7. Railways are a summation of the basic capitalist industries, coal, iron, and steel, a summation and the most striking index of the development of world trade and bourgeois democratic civilization. How the railways are linked up with large-scale industry, with monopolies, syndicates, cartels, trusts, banks, and the financial oligarchy is shown in the preceding chapters of the book. The uneven distribution of the railways, their uneven development, sums up, as it were, modern monopolist capitalism on a worldwide scale. And this summary proves that imperialist wars are absolutely inevitable under such an economic system, as long as private property and the means of production exists. The building of railways seems to be a simple, natural, democratic, cultural, and civilizing enterprise. That is what it is in the opinion of the bourgeois professors who are paid to depict capitalist slavery in bright colors, and in the opinion of petty bourgeois Philistines. But as a matter of fact, the capitalist threads, which in thousands of different intercrossings bind these enterprises with private property and the means of production in general, have converted this railway construction into an instrument for oppressing 1,000 million people in the colonies and semi-colonies. That is, more than half the population of the globe that inhabits the dependent countries, as well as the wage slaves of capital in the civilized countries. Private property, based on the labor of the small proprietor, free competition, democracy, all the catchwords with which the capitalists and their press deceive the workers and the peasants, are things of the distant past. Capitalism has grown into a world system of colonial oppression and of the financial strangulation of the overwhelming majority of the population of the world by a handful of advanced countries. And this booty is shared between 2 or 3 powerful world plunderers armed to the teeth, America, Great Britain, Japan, who are drawing the whole world into their war over the division of their booty. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, dictated by monarchist Germany, and the subsequent much more brutal and despicable Treaty of Versailles, dictated by the democratic republics of America and France, and also by Free Britain, have rendered a most useful service to humanity by exposing both imperialism's hired coolies of the pen and petty bourgeois reactionaries who, although they call themselves pacifists and socialists, sang praises to Wilsonism and insisted that peace and reforms were possible under imperialism. The tens of millions of dead and maimed left by the war, a war to decide whether the British or German group of financial plunderers is to receive the most booty, and those 2 peace treaties are with unprecedented rapidity opening the eyes of the millions and tens of millions of people who are downtrodden, oppressed, deceived, and duped by the bourgeoisie. Thus, out of the universal ruin caused by the war, a worldwide revolutionary crisis is arising which, however prolonged and arduous its stages might be, cannot end otherwise than in a proletarian revolution and in its victory. The Basel Manifesto of the Second International, which in 1912 gave an appraisal of the very war that broke out in 1914, and not of war in general, there are different kinds of wars, including revolutionary wars, this manifesto is now a monument exposing to the full the shameful bankruptcy and treachery of the heroes of the Second International. That is why I reproduce this manifesto as a supplement to the present edition, and again, I urge the reader to note that the heroes of the Second International are as assiduously avoiding the passages of this manifesto which speak precisely, clearly, and definitely of the connection between the impending war and the proletarian revolution as a thief avoids the scene of a crime. Special attention has been devoted in this pamphlet to a criticism of Kautskyism, the international ideological trend represented in all countries of the world by the most prominent theoreticians, the leaders of the Second International, Otto Bauer and Co. in Austria, Ramsay MacDonald and others in Britain, Albert Thomas in France, etc., etc., and a multitude of socialists, reformists, pacifists, bourgeois democrats, and parsons. This ideological trend is, on the one hand, a product of the disintegration and of the Second International, and on the other hand, the inevitable fruit of the ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, whose entire way of life holds them captive to bourgeois and democratic prejudices. The views held by Kautsky and his like are a complete renunciation of those same revolutionary principles of Marxism that writer has championed for decades, especially, by the way, in his struggle against socialist opportunism of Bernstein, Millerand, Hindman, Gompers, etc. It is not a mere accident, therefore, that Kautsky's followers all over the world have now united in practical politics with the extreme opportunists through the Second or Yellow International, and with the bourgeois governments through bourgeois coalition governments in which socialists take part. The growing world proletarian revolutionary movement in general, and the communist movement in particular, cannot dispense with an analysis and exposure of the theoretical errors of Kautskyism. The more so since pacifism and democracy in general, which lay no claim to Marxism whatever, but which, like Kautsky and Co., are obscuring the profundity of the contradictions of imperialism and the inevitable revolutionary crisis to which it gives rise, are still very widespread all over the world. To combat these tendencies is the bounden duty of the party of the proletariat, which must win away from the bourgeoisie the small proprietors who are duped by them, and the millions of working people who enjoy more or less petty bourgeois conditions of life. A few words must be said about Chapter 8, Parasitism and Decay of Capitalism. As already pointed out in the text, Hilferding, ex-Marxist, and now a comrade in arms of Kautsky and one of the chief exponents of bourgeois reformist policy in the independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, has taken a step backward on this question compared with the frankly pacifist and reformist Englishman Hobson. The international split of the entire working class movement is now quite evident, the Second and the Third Internationals. The fact that armed struggle and civil war is now raging between the two trends is also evident. The support given to Kolchak and Denikin in Russia by the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries against the Bolsheviks, the fights the Scheidermans and Nosks have conducted in conjunction with the bourgeoisie against the Spartakists in Germany, the same thing in Finland, Poland, Hungary, etc. What is the economic basis of this world historical phenomenon? It is precisely the parasitism and decay of capitalism, characteristic of its highest historical stage of development, i.e. imperialism. As this pamphlet shows, capitalism has now singled out a handful, less than 1/10 of the inhabitants of the globe, less than 1/5 at the most generous and liberal calculation, of exceptionally rich and powerful states which plunder the whole world simply by clipping coupons. Capital exports yield an income of 8 to 10,000 million francs per annum at pre-war prices and according to pre-war bourgeois statistics. Now, of course, they yield much more. Obviously, out of such enormous super profits, since they are obtained over and above the profits which capitalists squeeze out of their workers of their own country, it is possible to bribe the labor leaders and the upper stratum of the labor aristocracy. And that is just what the capitalists of the advanced countries are doing. They are bribing them in 1,000 different ways, direct and indirect, overt and covert. This stratum of workers turned bourgeois or the labor aristocracy, who are quite Philistine in their mode of life, in the size of their earnings and in their entire outlook, is the principal prop of the Second International, and in our days, the principal social, not military prop of the bourgeoisie. For they are the real agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement, the labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, real vehicles of reformism and chauvinism. In the civil war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, they inevitably and in no small numbers take the side of the bourgeoisie, the Versaillese, against the communards. Unless the economic roots of this phenomenon are understood and its political and social significance is appreciated, not a step can be taken toward the solution of the practical problem of the communist movement and of the impending social revolution. Imperialism is the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat. This has been confirmed since 1917 on a worldwide scale. N. Lenin, July 6, 1920. During the last 15 to 20 years, especially since the Spanish-American War, 1898, and the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, the economic and also the political literature of the two hemispheres has more and more often adopted the term imperialism in order to describe the present era. In 1902, a book by the English economist J.A. Hobson, Imperialism, was published in London and New York. This author, whose point of view is that of bourgeois social reformism and pacifism, which, in essence, is identical with the present point of view of the ex-Marxist Karl Kautsky, gives a very good and comprehensive description of the principal specific economic and political features of imperialism. In 1910, there appeared in Vienna the work of the Austrian Marxist Rudolf Hilferding, Finance Capital, Russian edition, Moscow, 1912. In spite of the mistake the author makes on the theory of money, and in spite of a certain inclination on his part to reconcile Marxism with opportunism, this work gives a very valuable theoretical analysis of the latest phase of capitalist development, as the subtitle runs. Indeed, what has been said of imperialism during the last few years, especially in an enormous number of magazine and newspaper articles, and also in the resolutions, for example, of the Chemnitz and Basel Congresses, which took place in the autumn of 1912, has scarcely gone beyond the ideas expounded, or more exactly, summed up by the two writers mentioned above. Later on, I shall try to show briefly, and as simply as possible, the connection and relationship between the principal economic features of imperialism. I shall not be able to deal with the non-economic aspects of the question, however much they deserve to be dealt with. References to literature and other notes which, perhaps, would not interest all readers are to be found at the end of this pamphlet. Chapter 1. Concentration of Production and Monopolies. The enormous growth of industry and the remarkably rapid concentration of production in ever larger enterprises are one of the most characteristic features of capitalism. Modern production censuses give most complete and most exact data on this process. In Germany, for example, out of every 1,000 industrial enterprises, large enterprises, i.e., those employing more than 50 workers, numbered 3 in 1882, 6 in 1895, and 9 in 1907. And out of every 100 workers employed, this group of enterprises employed 22, 30, and 37, respectively. Concentration of production, however, is much more intense than the concentration of workers, since labor in the large enterprises is much more productive. This is shown by the figures on steam engines and electric motors. If we take what in Germany is called industry in the broad sense of the term, that is, including commerce, transport, etc., we get the following picture. Large-scale enterprises, 30,588, out of a total of 3,265,623, that is to say 0.9%. These enterprises employ 5,700,000 workers out of a total of 14,400,000, i.e. 39.4%. They use 6,600,000 steam horsepower out of a total of 8,800,000, i.e. 75.3%, and 1,200,000 kilowatts of electricity out of a total of 1,500,000, i.e. 77.2%. Less than 1/100th of a total number of enterprises utilize more than 3/4 of the total amount of steam and electric power. 2,970,000 small enterprises employing up to 5 workers, constituting 91% of the total, utilize only 7% of the total amount of steam and electric power. Tens of thousands of huge enterprises are everything. Millions of small ones are nothing. In 1907, there were in Germany 586 establishments employing 1,000 and more workers, nearly 1/10, 1,380,000, of the total number of workers employed in industry, and they consumed almost 1/3, 32%, of the total amount of steam and electric power. As we shall see, money capital and the banks makes this superiority of a handful of the largest enterprises still more overwhelming, in the most literal sense of the word, i.e., millions of small, medium, and even some big proprietors are in fact in complete subjection to some hundreds of millionaire financiers. In another advanced country of modern capitalism, the United States of America, the growth of the concentration of production is still greater. Here statistics single out industry in the narrow sense of the word and classify enterprises according to the value of their annual output. In 1904, large-scale enterprises with an output value at $1 million and over numbered 1,900 out of 216,180, i.e. 0.9%. These employed 1,400,000 workers out of 5,500,000, i.e. 25.6%, and the value of their output amounted to 5,600,000,000 out of 14,800,000,000, i.e. 38%. 5 years later, in 1909, the corresponding figures were 3,060 enterprises out of 268,491, i.e. 1.1%, employing 2 million workers out of 6,600,000, i.e. 30.5%, with an output valued at 9 billion out of 20,700,000,000, i.e. 43.8%. Almost half the total production of all the enterprises of the country was carried on by 1/100th part of these enterprises. These 3,000 giant enterprises embrace 258 branches of industry. From this, it can be seen that at a certain stage of its development, concentration itself, as it were, leads straight to monopoly, for a score or so of giant enterprises can easily arrive at an agreement, and on the other hand, the hindrance of competition, the tendency towards monopoly, arises from the huge size of the enterprises. This transformation of competition into monopoly is one of the most important, if not the most important, phenomena of modern capitalist economy, and we must deal with it in greater detail. But first, we must clear up one possible misunderstanding. American statistics speak of 3,000 giant enterprises in 250 branches of industry, as if there were only a dozen enterprises of the largest scale for each branch of industry. But this is not the case. Not in every branch of industry are there large-scale enterprises, and moreover, a very important feature of capitalism in its highest stage of development is so-called combination of production, that is to say, the grouping in a single enterprise of different branches of industry, which either represent the consecutive stages in the processing of raw materials, for example, the smelting of iron ore into pig iron, the conversion of pig iron into steel, and then, perhaps, the manufacture of steel goods, or are auxiliary to one another, for example, the utilization of scrap or of byproducts, the manufacture of packing materials, etc. Combination, writes Hilferding, levels out the fluctuations of trade and therefore assures to the combined enterprises a more stable rate of profit. Secondly, combination has the effect of eliminating trade. Thirdly, it has the effect of rendering possible technical improvements and, consequently, the acquisition of super profits over and above those obtained by the pure, i.e., non-combined enterprises. Fourthly, it strengthens the position of the combined enterprises relative to the pure enterprises, strengthens them in the competitive struggle in periods of serious depression when the fall in prices of raw materials does not keep pace with the fall of prices in manufactured goods. The German bourgeois economist, Heyman, who has written a book especially on mixed, that is, combined enterprises in the German iron industry, says, "Pure enterprises perish. They are crushed between the high price of raw material and the low price of the finished product. Thus we get the following picture. There remain on the one hand the big coal companies producing millions of tons yearly, strongly organized in their coal syndicate, and on the other, the big steel plants closely allied to the coal mines, having their own steel syndicate. These giant enterprises producing 400,000 tons of steel per annum with a tremendous output of ore and coal and producing finished steel goods, employing 10,000 workers quartered in company houses, and sometimes owning their own railways and ports, are the typical representatives of the German iron and steel industry, and concentration goes on further and further. Individual enterprises are becoming larger and larger. An ever-increasing number of enterprises in one, or in several different industries, join together in giant enterprises, backed up and directed by half a dozen big Berlin banks in relation to the German mining industry. The truth of the teachings of Karl Marx on concentration is definitely proved. True, this applies to a country where industry is protected by tariffs and freight rates. The German mining industry is ripe for expropriation. Such is the conclusion which a bourgeois economist who, by way of exception, is conscientious had to arrive at. It must be noted that he seems to place Germany in a special category because her industries are protected by higher tariffs. But this is a circumstance which only accelerates concentration and the formation of monopolist manufacturers associations, cartels, syndicates, etc. It is extremely important to note that in free trade Britain, concentration also leads to monopoly, although somewhat later and perhaps in another form. Professor Herman Levy, in his special work of research entitled Monopolies, Cartels and Trusts, based on data on British economic development, writes as follows. In Great Britain, it is the size of the enterprise and its high technical level which harbor a monopolist tendency. This, for one thing, is due to the great investment of capital per enterprise, which gives rise to increasing demands for new capital for the new enterprises and thereby renders their launching more difficult. Moreover, and this seems to us to be the more important point, every new enterprise that wants to keep pace with the gigantic enterprises that have been formed by concentration would here produce such an enormous quantity of surplus goods that it could dispose of them only by being able to sell them profitably as a result of an enormous increase in demand. Otherwise, this surplus would force prices down to a level that would be unprofitable both for the new enterprise and for the monopoly combines. Britain differs from other countries where protective tariffs facilitate the formation of cartels in that monopolist manufacturers associations, cartels and trusts, arise in the majority of cases only when the number of the chief competing enterprises has been reduced to a couple of dozen or so. Here the influence of concentration on the formation of large industrial monopolies in a whole sphere of industry stands out with crystal clarity. Half a century ago, when Marx was writing Capital, free competition appeared to the overwhelming majority of economists to be a natural law. Official science tried, by a conspiracy of silence, to kill the works of Marx, who by a theoretical and historical analysis of capitalism had proved that free competition gives rise to the concentration of production, which, in turn, at a certain stage of development, leads to monopoly. Today, monopoly has become the fact. Economists are writing mountains of books in which they describe the diverse manifestations of monopoly, and continue to declare in chorus that Marxism is refuted. But facts are stubborn things, as the English proverb says, and they have to be reckoned with, whether we like it or not. The facts show that differences between capitalist countries, e.g., in the matter of protection or free trade, only give rise to insignificant variations in the form of monopolies or in the moment of their appearance, and that the rise of monopolies, as the result of the concentration of production, is a general and fundamental law of the present stage of development of capitalism. For Europe, The time when the new capitalism definitely superseded the old can be established with fair precision. It was the beginning of the 20th century. In one of the latest compilations on the history of the formation of monopolies, we read, isolated examples of capitalist monopoly could be cited from the period preceding 1860. In these could be discerned the embryo of the forms that are so common today, but all this undoubtedly represents the prehistory of the cartels. The real beginning of modern monopoly goes back, at the earliest, to the 60s. The first important period of development of monopoly commenced with the international industrial depression of the 70s and lasted until the beginning of the 90s. If we examine the question on a European scale, we will find that the development of free competition reached its apex in the 60s and 70s. It was then that Britain completed the construction of her old-style capitalist organization. In Germany, this organization had entered into a fierce struggle with handicraft and domestic industry, and had begun to create for itself its own forms of existence. The Great Revolution commenced with the crash of 1873, or rather, the depression which followed it and which, with hardly discernible interruptions in the early 80s and the unusually violent but short-lived boom around 1889, marks 22 years of European economic history. During the short boom of 1889 to 90, the system of cartels was widely resorted to in order to take advantage of favorable business conditions. An ill-considered policy drove prices up still more rapidly and still higher than would have been the case if there had been no cartels, and nearly all these cartels perished ingloriously in the smash. Another 5-year period of bad trade and low prices followed, but a new spirit reigned in industry. The depression was no longer regarded as something to be taken for granted. It was regarded as nothing more than a pause before another boom. The cartel movement entered its second epoch. Instead of being a transitory phenomenon, the cartels have become one of the foundations of economic life. They are winning one field of industry after another, primarily the raw materials industry. At the beginning of the 90s, the cartel system had already acquired in the organization of the Coke Syndicate, on the model of which the Coal Syndicate was later formed, a cartel technique which has hardly been improved on. For the first time, the great boom at the close of the 19th century and the crisis of 1900-3 occurred entirely, in the mining and iron industries at least, until the aegis of the cartels. And while at that time it appeared to be something novel, now the general public takes it for granted that large spheres of economic life have been, as a general rule, removed from the realm of free competition. Thus, the principal stages in the history of monopolies are the following. 1. 1860 to 70, the highest stage, the apex of development of free competition. Monopoly is in the barely discernible embryonic stage. 2. After the crisis of 1873, a lengthy period of development of cartels, but they are still the exception. They are not yet durable. They are still a transitory phenomenon. 3. The boom at the end of the 19th century and the crisis of 1900-3. Cartels become one of the foundations of the whole of economic life. Capitalism has been transformed into imperialism. Cartels come to an agreement on the terms of sale, dates of payment, etc. They divide the markets among themselves. They fix the quantity of goods to be produced. They fix prices. They divide the profits among the various enterprises, etc. The number of cartels in Germany was estimated at about 250 in 1896 and at 385 in 1905, with about 12,000 firms participating. But it is generally recognized that these figures are underestimations. From the statistics of German industry for 1907 we quoted above, it is evident that even these 12,000 very big enterprises probably consume more than half the steam and electric power used in the country. In the United States of America, the number of trusts in 1900 was estimated at 185 and in 1907, 250. American statistics divide all industrial enterprises into those belonging to individuals, to private firms, or to corporations. The latter in 1904 comprised 23.6% and in 1909, 25.9%, i.e., more than 1/4 of the total industrial enterprises in the country. These employed in 1904 70.6% and in 1909, 75.6%, i.e., more than 3/4 of the total wage earners. Their output at these two dates was valued at $10.9 billion and $16.3 billion, i.e., 73.7% and 79% of the total, respectively. At times, cartels and trusts concentrate in their hands 7 or 8/10ths of the total output of a given branch of industry. The Rhine-Westphalian Coal Syndicate, at its foundation in 1893, concentrated 86.7% of the total coal output of the area, and in 1910, it already concentrated 95.4%. The monopoly so created assures enormous profits and leads to the formation of technical production units of formidable magnitude. The famous Standard Oil Company in the United States was founded in 1900. It has an authorized capital of $150 million. It issued 100 million common and 106 million preferred stock. From 1900 to 1907, the following dividends were paid on the latter: 48, 48, 45, 44, 36, 40, 40, 40% in the respective years, i.e., in all, 367 million. From 1882 to 1907, out of total net profits amounting to 889 million, 606 million were distributed in dividends, and the rest went to reserve capital. In 1907, the various works of the United States Steel Corporation employed no less than 180 people. The largest enterprise in the German mining industry, Gelsenkirchener Bergwerksgesellschaft, in 1908 had a staff of 46,048 workers and office employees. In 1902, the United States Steel Corporation already produced 9 million tons of steel. Its output constituted in 1901 66.3% and in 1908 56.1% of the total output of steel in the United States. The output of ore was 43.9% and 46.3% respectively. The report of the American Government Commission on Trusts states, "Their superiority over competitors is due to the magnitude of their enterprises and their excellent technical equipment. Since its inception, the Tobacco Trust has devoted all its efforts to the universal substitution of mechanical for manual labor. With this end in view, it has brought up all patents that have anything to do with the manufacture of tobacco and has spent enormous sums for this purpose. Many of these patents at first proved to be of no use and had to be modified by the engineers employed by the trust. At the end of 1906, 2 subsidiary companies were formed solely to acquire patents. With the same object in view, the trust has built its own foundries, machine shops, and repair shops. One of these establishments, that in Brooklyn, employs on the average 300 workers. Here, experiments are carried out on inventions concerning the manufacture of cigarettes, cheroots, snuff, tinfoil for packing, boxes, etc. Here also, inventions are perfected. Other trusts also employ what are called development engineers, whose business it is to devise new methods of production and to test technical improvements. The United States Steel Corporation grants big bonuses to its workers and engineers for all inventions that raise technical efficiency or reduce cost production. In German large-scale industry, e.g., in the chemical industry, which has developed so enormously during these last few decades, the promotion of technical improvement is organized in the same way. By 1908, the process of concentration of production had already given rise to 2 main groups which, in their way, were also in the nature of monopolies. At first, these groups constituted dual alliances of 2 pairs of big factories, each having a capital from 20 to 21 million marks on the one hand, the former Meister factory in Horst and the Casella factory in Frankfurt am Main, and on the other hand, the aniline and soda factory at Ludwigshafen and the former Bayer factory at Elberfeld. Then, in 1905, one of these groups and in 1908 the other group each concluded an agreement with yet another big factory. The result was the formation of the 2 triple alliances, each with a capital of from 40 to 50 million marks, and these alliances have already begun to approach each other to reach an understanding about prices, etc. Competition becomes transformed into monopoly. The result is immense progress in the socialization of production. In particular, the process of technical invention and improvements becomes socialized. This is something quite different from the old free competition between manufacturers, scattered and out of touch with one another, and producing for an unknown market. Concentration has reached the point at which it is possible to make an approximate estimate of all sources of raw material, for example, the iron ore deposits of a country and even, as we shall see, of several countries, or of the whole world. Not only are such estimates made, but these sources are captured by gigantic monopolist associations. An approximate estimate of the capacity of markets is also made, and the associations divide them up among themselves by agreement. Skilled labor is monopolized. The best engineers are engaged. The means of transport are captured. Railways in America, shipping companies in Europe and America. Capitalism in its imperialist stage leads directly to the most comprehensive socialization of production. It, so to speak, drags the capitalists, against their will and consciousness, into some sort of a new social order, a transitional one from complete free competition to complete socialization. Production becomes social, but appropriation remains private. The social means of production remain the private property of a few. The general framework of formally recognized free competition remains, and the yoke of a few monopolists on the rest of the population becomes 100 times heavier, more burdensome, and intolerable. The German economist, Kästner, has written a book especially devoted to the struggle between the cartels and outsiders, i.e., the capitalists outside the cartels. He entitled his work Compulsory Organization, although, in order to present capitalism in its true light, he should, of course, have written about compulsory submission to monopolist associations. It is instructive to glance at least at the list of the methods the monopolist associations resort to in the present day, the latest, the civilized struggle for organization. 1. Stopping supplies of raw materials. One of the most important methods of compelling adherence to the cartel. 2. Stopping the supply of labor by means of alliances, i.e., of agreements between capitalists and the trade unions by which the latter permit their members to work only in cartelized enterprises. 3. Stopping deliveries. 4. Closing trade outlets. 5. Agreements with the buyers by which the latter undertake to trade only with the cartels. 6. Systematic price cutting to ruin outside firms, i.e., those which refuse to submit to the monopolists. Millions are spent in order to sell goods for a certain time below their cost price. There were instances when the price of petrol was thus reduced from 40 to 22 marks, i.e., almost by half. 7. Stopping credits. 8. Boycott. Here we no longer have competition between small and large, between technically developed and backward enterprises. We see here the monopolists throttling those who do not submit to them, to their yoke, to their dictation. This is how this process is reflected in the mind of a bourgeois economist. Even in the purely economic sphere, writes Kästner, a certain change is taking place from commercial activity in the old sense of the word towards organizational speculative activity. The greatest success no longer goes to the merchant whose technical and commercial experience enables him best of all to estimate the needs of the buyer, and who is able to discover and, so to speak, awaken a latent demand. It goes to the speculative genius who knows how to estimate, or even only to sense in advance, the organizational development and possibilities of certain connections between individual enterprises and the banks. Translated into ordinary human language, this means that the development of capitalism has arrived at a stage when, although commodity production still reigns and continues to be regarded as the basis of economic life, it has in reality been undermined, and the bulk of the profits go to the geniuses of financial manipulation. At the basis of these manipulations and swindles lies socialized production, but the immense progress of mankind which achieved this socialization goes to benefit the speculators. We shall see later how, on these grounds, reactionary, petty bourgeois critics of capitalist imperialism dream of going back to free, peaceful, and honest competition. The prolonged raising of prices which results from the formation of cartels, says Kästner, has hitherto been observed only in respect of the most important means of production, particularly coal, iron, and potassium, but never in respect of manufactured goods. Similarly, the increase in profits resulting from this raising of prices has been limited only to the industries which produce means of production. To this observation, we must add that the industries which process raw materials and not semi-manufactures not only secure advantages from the cartel formation in the shape of high profits to the detriment of the finished goods industry, but have also secured a dominating position over the latter, which did not exist under free competition. The words which I have italicized reveal the essence of the case which the bourgeois economists admit so reluctantly and so rarely, and which the present-day defenders of opportunism, led by Kautsky, so zealously try to evade the brush aside. Domination and the violence that is associated with it, such are the relationships that are typical of the latest phase of capitalist development. This is what inevitably had to result and has resulted from the formation of all-powerful economic monopolies. I shall give one more example of the methods employed by the cartels. Where it is possible to capture all or the chief sources of raw materials, the rise of cartels and formation of monopolies is particularly easy. It would be wrong, however, to assume that monopolies do not arise in other industries in which it is impossible to corner the sources of raw materials. The cement industry, for example, can find its raw materials everywhere. Yet in Germany, this industry too is strongly cartelized. The cement manufacturers have formed regional syndicates, South German, Rhine-Westphalian, etc. The prices fixed are monopoly prices, 230 to 280 marks a carload, when the cost price is 180 marks. The enterprises pay a dividend from 12 to 16%, and it must not be forgotten that the geniuses of modern speculation know how to pocket big profits besides what they draw in dividends. In order to prevent competition in such a profitable industry, the monopolists even resort to various stratagems. They spread false rumors about the bad situation in their industry. Anonymous warnings are published in the newspapers, like the following. Capitalists, don't invest your capital in the cement industry. Lastly, they buy up outsiders, those outside the syndicates, and pay them compensation of 60,000, 80,000, and even 150,000 marks. Monopoly hews a path for itself without scruple as to the means, from paying a modest sum to buy off competitors to the American device of employing dynamite against them. The statement that cartels can abolish crises is a fable spread by bourgeois economists who at all costs desire to place capitalism in a favorable light. On the contrary, the monopoly created in certain branches of industry increases and intensifies the anarchy inherent in capitalist production as a whole. The disparity between the development of agriculture and that of industry, which is characteristic of capitalism in general, is increased. The privileged position of the most highly cartelized, so-called heavy industry, especially coal and iron, causes a still greater lack of coordination. In other branches of industry, as J. Dells, the author of one of the best works on the relationship of the German big banks to industry, admits, the more developed an economic system, writes Liefman, an unblushing apologist of capitalism, the more it resorts to risky enterprises, or enterprises in other countries, to those which need a great deal of time to develop, or finally, to those which are only of local importance. The increased risk is connected in the long run with a prodigious increase of capital, which, as it were, overflows the brim, flows abroad, etc. At the same time, the extremely rapid rate of technical progress gives rise to increasing elements of disparity between the various spheres of national economy, to anarchy and crises. Liefman is obliged to admit that, in all probability, mankind will see further important technical revolutions in the near future which will also affect the organization of the economic system, electricity and aviation. As a general rule, in such periods of radical economic change, speculation develops on a large scale. Crises of every kind, economic crises most frequently, but not only these, in their turn increase very considerably the tendency towards concentration and towards monopoly. In this connection, the following reflections of J. Dells on the significance of the crisis of 1900, which, as we have already seen, marked the turning point in the history of modern monopoly, are exceedingly instructive. Side by side with the gigantic plants in the basic industries, the crisis of 1900 still found many plants organized on lines that today would be considered obsolete. The pure, non-combined plants, which were brought into being at the height of the industrial boom. The fall in prices and the falling off in demand put these pure enterprises in a precious position, which did not affect the gigantic combined enterprises at all or only affected them for a short time. As a consequence of this crisis of 1900 resulted in a far greater concentration of industry than the crisis of 1873. The latter crisis also produced a sort of selection of the best equipped enterprises, but owing to the level of technical development at that time, this selection could not place the firms which successfully emerged from the crisis in a position of monopoly. Such a durable monopoly exists to a high degree in the gigantic enterprises in the modern iron and steel and electrical industries owing to their complicated technique, far-reaching organization and magnitude of capital, and, to a lesser degree, in the engineering industry, certain branches of the metallurgical industry, transport, etc. Monopoly. This is the last word in the latest phase of capitalist development. but we shall only have a very insufficient, incomplete, and poor notion of the real power and the significance of modern monopolies if we do not take into consideration the part played by the banks.
Okay, I've exceeded my time. I will stop the share and stop the live stream. Remind you that I think we're going to go at 6:30 to the People's Forum class on imperialism, and for which this was one of the readings. And I hope you'll take a moment to at least scan through it to see what the key points are. Lenin does actually make more sense when somebody's reading it, with all due respect. So I will stop share. And